Good afternoon, everyone. On a day that almost feels like the tropics in Belgium, and a glimmer of sun for the first or second or third time, maybe in 12 months. But anyway, Brussels, we love you. So very glad that so many of you could join us today. We do have a number of other people who are registered, and I imagine that they will make their way slowly here, but I think we have quite a few issues to discuss today, and we might as well just get going. Just to say that this is the third and final, for now, event in a three-part series which we have hosted here over the last couple of months. Really and truly, the intent has been to interrogate this period of rolling crises or polycrises and their effects on different parts of the world and through different lenses. Our first event in this particular series, we discussed the war in Ukraine, Russian-Ukrainian relations. I did this with my colleague here, Vladimir. And it was a very, very lively discussion. We had people represented from many parts of the world because though, of course, this is a war in Europe, the impacts have been felt across the world. And one of the points that I would like to touch on today with my friend, compatriot and colleague, dear Junior Lodge, whom I will introduce a little bit more formally in a while, is that countries of the Global South have been disproportionately affected by all of these consequences. Historically high inflation, sovereign debt, all against the backdrop of an existential crisis, which is known as climate change as we speak. The Caribbean has just been traumatized by a historic hurricane so early in the hurricane season, a Category 5 hurricane formed in the Atlantic before making its way across the Windward Islands and then Jamaica and so on and so forth. It's just now made landfall in Texas, I believe, as a Category 2 storm. But this is just the beginning of a season which the Hurricane Center in Florida has already announced will be unprecedented. This is scary for several reasons. One, in that, you know, in these islands, we have no troops that come out to assist, to rebuild, to clear anything. What we have seen in recent days of video after video on TikTok and all of these, of all boats of any size, leaving whatever safe port they're in, heading for the Grenadine Islands, Grenada, St. Vincent, with bottled water, Pampers, everything that you could think of. And everybody in the Caribbean who has anything to share by way of canned goods has delivered them on the wharf to be taken by just a flotilla of boats of all sizes, just to help others. And there's beauty in that as well, and I don't mean to take away from the seriousness of this. There's beauty in that when you know that the cavalry is not coming, it builds a certain amount of resilience. And there is a sense in the Caribbean that we are each other's keepers. And you see that in the relations between Venezuela and the Eastern Caribbean countries. You see that in the relations with Cuba, for example, and so on and so forth. Maybe we will even get to have these conversations in another segment of a new series. But here we are. We have discussed, as we said, you know, the implications of the war in Ukraine. We have also, 3 weeks ago, discussed the role of Europe. Is there a new role for Europe in terms of all of these crises? And of course, all of these crises have done a number of things. One, which is most important, which I speak about all the time, is a sense of a deepening divide between the West and the rest of the world, in which 85% of the world's people live. And that is a reality. I'm not quite sure how we bridge that divide in terms of dealing with the multilateralism that is so important in terms of global governance for achieving global public goods. But today we are going to focus on the effect of all of those crises on global trade. And the one point that I want to make before introducing my colleague and friend is to say that why global trade? Why is trade even an important subject for us to discuss? But the fact of the matter is, for the global south, for countries, developing countries, trade has been a very important tool of development. There are no two ways about it. And over the last many decades, it has lifted millions out of poverty, and there's been a sense of shared prosperity. Of course, there's deep inequality between countries and regions, and even increasingly within countries that create their own tensions. But the role of global trade and globalization is indisputable for all countries of the global south. One of the questions that we have right now, as we see, for example, Junior, one of the things that I will put to you, as you know, there was a time when global trade was based on the principle of open market, open markets, the lowering of tariffs, and now we're seeing, and comparative advantage and low cost. And now we're seeing those very principles replaced by other considerations, more strategic, more geopolitical. And what I think of as well is, you know, we're seeing geo-economics and geopolitics collide. So this is where we are. And allow me now to introduce to you, I keep on saying my compatriot, he's from Jamaica, but a citizen of the world. Not but, and a citizen of the world, more appropriately. He is a former colleague, also a very good and cherished friend, whom I know feels and thinks and expresses quite passion on a number of subjects that we will speak about today. He is also the Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of African, Caribbean, Pacific Group of Countries for economic and structural transformation and trade. I got all of that right. So, Junior, if I may, welcome. And I'm going to start with the first of many questions to you. As we consider this particular period of crisis, well, it may be unprecedented in many ways, you know. One of the memories that I have, it's a very stark one and not a very pleasant one. A couple of years ago, you will recall the images that we saw as Sri Lanka moved closer and closer to sovereign debt collapse. The chaos on the street, the government collapsed. In fact, the government fled. And it brings to mind the fact that one of the points which I just made before, but we haven't had a conversation around, the stark importance of development for countries which are poor, which is a point that sometimes I think escapes our many friends in the West who consider threats from a different perspective, military third-party persons who are unfriendly. For countries of the global south, the inability to support the aspirations of their people and development is perhaps the most important security threat to their existence. Given all of the crises that we have seen recently, Junior, what would you consider to be some of the worst consequences which have had to be managed in recent times?
Thank you very much. And what a simple question to throw at me just to commence proceedings. But let me say it's great to be here. It's great to be having what I call a structured dialogue with you, because we have had many, if not numerous, exchanges. And while they have been riveted, they have neither been structured and certainly not public. So we are entering a new space. What are the major challenges that we are facing? Obviously, they are numerous, and they threaten not only our economic existence, they even threaten the very existence of our societies and countries. So today, we're living in Belgium. We throw a glance out and we see that it is raining. Earlier today, I saw that there was an adverse weather warning. Um, uh, Now, I don't want to be quick in condemning or attributing this to climate change, but it is not to be discounted. Two brief examples. One you referenced before, which is Hurricane Beryl, that has visited uh, and inflicted tremendous structural damage and loss of lives in the Caribbean. Um, the suggestion is that we in the Caribbean have never experienced a, a hurricane of that magnitude so early in the season. So again, there's a very strong evidence of the impact of climate change. And of course, another example is in terms of flooding that we're witnessing in China. Flooding recently witnessed in another country that I hold dear, which is Germany. Very, very strong high temperatures in the United States. So the evidence in terms of the impact of climate change is rather clear and poses an existential threat, especially to a group of countries that we hold dear, namely small island developing states. But of course, this is also an indication of a broader issue, which is in terms of how do countries that are experiencing climate change cope with the challenges of resilience and also with the challenge of adverse climate patterns and the implications for productivity. So, for example, most of our countries have a strong agricultural sector, and obviously agriculture has been the backbone for both economic sustenance, but also decent jobs. How do you navigate that process in that context? So climate change is obviously one major significant issue. I think that we are still managing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, both in terms of output, but more importantly, in terms of an awareness about the fragility of our medical health systems. COVID-19 is definitely wired into our economic performance at the moment. And of course, you cannot discount the fact that most of our countries, by dint of our economic profile, we are heavily trade dependent. This is one of the characteristics of being a small economy, where trade as a proportion of your GDP is significantly high, but that also means that you're exposed to the vagaries of the global economy. And the global economy, almost per definition, remains unfair to the interest of small economies. So most recently, I had a conversation with a trade expert based in Geneva, and we were talking about the lack of progress of the DDA, the Doha Development Agenda, and the fact that this set of negotiations was aimed at recalibrating the multilateral trading system in favor of developing countries, prioritizing development. And more than 20 years later, we are yet to see the kind of progress that we had envisaged. And here we see even some convergence in terms of these seemingly disparate issues, so climate change and trade. So one of the sticking points at the last ministerial, the 13th ministerial of the WTO, was fishery subsidies. Strangely enough, the European Union, which exercises and uses fisheries subsidies heavily, remains silent on that issue because there are a number of EU member states that are significant, that have significant offshore fishing fleets that exercise partnership agreements, especially in terms of, for example, like tuna. Um, and we also saw the silence of another major trading partner, China, on fisheries subsidies. But the consequence of that is that these countries, in particular the SIDS, their existence as economic polities, but also as physical territories are threatened, and yet we don't seem to muster the political will to focus on these. So the big challenge is almost the unwavering inability of the global community to take development seriously. Now, in that context, there is an opportunity for us. And the opportunity is for us to reimagine what development means, recraft our own development agenda, and posit it in terms of discourse with our major partners. And that's an exercise which we have yet to seize. And therefore, while I might lament the crises and the impact that it has had on our countries, I think that there is an opportunity. I'll make one final point, however, on this, which is in this spectrum of looking at the various crises, I think we need to disaggregate them, because by disaggregating them, we can see some opportunities and at the same time some fault lines. So if you were to take the pandemic, for example, the pandemic underscores the interdependence of the global community. It beckons a global response, and therefore we see it in the context or framework of the World Health Organization, where there are negotiations on pandemic preparations. Perhaps not as robust and as ambitious as we would like, but of course it is registering that we need to harness the experience of the pandemic. But the pandemic also underscores the injustice that is almost at the heart of not only our trading system, but in terms of the delivery of global public goods. Because of course, you saw the differentiated access to vaccines. And again, in fairness, one has to say that a number of our countries, Rwanda in particular, they are exercising their right, which is already enshrined within the WTO, in terms of securing independent production of vaccines. So there are opportunities, but there are challenges. Another opportunity, if I may just conclude on this, is in terms of climate change, because again, we see the universal impact of climate change. And we have had these iterations of COPs, which are yet to result in any earnest action. We have seen climate financing, which have been made available. The European Union has been active in that sphere, but most of that funding has actually been loans. So it comes back to this question in terms of debt, where you started off, where we don't seem to grasp not only the complexity of the development challenges, but how holistic a solution and a framework we need.
Thank you. Thanks, Junior. You know, as you spoke, I couldn't help but also think that both of the crises that you mentioned, pandemic and global climate change, underscored, in a sense, the fragmentation of the world into different blocks. So whilst, you know, the West was dithering over COVAX, for example, which took a very long time to get off the ground, the first, certainly in the Caribbean and Latin America, to support the delivery of vaccines were who? Russia, India, China. When at the WTO we saw conversations about pausing intellectual property rights to allow for a pause on patents to allow vaccines to be more readily produced in countries like South Africa, like India, like other countries that had the capability to do so in a very robust way. It was the African group, it was India together with Cuba who led that charge. They didn't get much support, right? And in COPs, I mean, we know that your countries, the Caribbean and Pacific countries of the OACP in EOSIS, lead the charge. You know, they really do shine in every COP. But the Pacific and Caribbean countries, namely in the personalities or sovereign states of Vanuatu and Antigua and Barbuda, are the ones who took the charge a few months ago and decided, well, you know, let's make the case for not being small island developing states, but big ocean states. And then having agreed on that, well then let's test the waters and see whether or not carbon is not a pollutant. Let's see where we get, and then they got, yes, yeah, carbon is a pollutant. So now they have a case that they're going to take all the way. So yes, the opportunities are there, but then again, it speaks to the stubbornness, the resilience of small countries to actually stand up with the moral clarity and the courage that it takes to say, this isn't working for us, what are we going to do for ourselves? And they will keep on knocking on those doors. So, yep. I mean, I have to remember this is public. I think, you know, you've really spoken to the importance of you know, trade as a tool of development. And we have quite a lot of questions that I want to make sure that we get through in the hour that you and I will talk before we invite all of our friends here to barge in, you know. One of the concerns has been, you know, I should reframe that. Sanctions on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine and now in their 12th iteration. It was interesting, a few weeks ago I was taking a look at the impact of the global pandemic on global trade, contracted. And then at the end of 2021, early 2022, we saw trade starting to rebuild. And then we had the invasion of Ukraine. And then in the first and second half of 2022, we saw global trade be depressed again. And of course, one can only assume that it has to do with the effects of the broader sanctions and what that did to trade. What has been the effect of sanctions on countries of the developing world for you? For some countries like India, for example, notably we've seen that, in fact, their trade with Russia has increased in that time. And not just India, but others as well. But by and large, broadly speaking, what have been the impacts that have had to be managed on top of everything else that has happened during COVID?
I hear you in terms of sanctions exercised or imposed by various countries on Russia. But I'm not convinced that that is indeed the major story here. The major story here is, first of all, a recognition, if we were unaware before, that both Russia and the Ukraine are significant agricultural suppliers. So that is the starting point. And in fact, in the case of the Ukraine, they are also significant suppliers of fertilizer. So the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has resulted in a massive leap in energy prices. They're now tapering down. But of course, that also had consequences for both fertilizer prices and food prices. So that, I think, is where the pitch should be in terms of looking at the impact on countries such as ours, where we needed some dispensation, some accommodation, and to a certain extent, we have seen some relief where Ukrainian wheat was released, made available to African countries in particular, in order to not only reduce prices in our countries, but also address poverty, hunger in particular. With respect to sanctions, obviously, we have not benefited from that. The beneficiaries of that have been, let's say, the larger countries. You mentioned quite a number of them. In my view, however, the issue of sanctions raises two issues. One, it underscores the value that we place on multilateralism. Because obviously, again, as small political polities, we see multilateralism as the shield against capricious, um, if not irresponsible, abuse of military power. So that is important, and that's something that we has always shaped our conviction, our philosophy, our orientation, and in fact our behavior in all global arenas. But the other element of the Russian invasion is in terms of the resilience of the supply chain. And it comes back again to this issue of climate change, because in a sense, we have learned from the language of climate change, the vernacular of climate change, in terms of the importance that we place on resilience. Because, of course, we saw the egregious impact of restricted trade on our economies, and we are still grappling with that. We are yet to assert that or raise that issue, for example, within the context of the WTO. And I think that that would be an important area where we need to address how let's say, the might and the weight of some of our major economic partners have debilitating impact on small economies such as ours. But there's this deep concern that I certainly have, which is questioning the extent to which the sanctions are indeed working as they are intended. And what that tells me is this broader issue that we need to have more evidence-based action. And I'm not in the least referring simply to the use of sanctions. I'm also coming back to my pet concern, which is in terms of how we craft development interventions and make sure that we can sustain the path. That's my deep interest.
Thank you. I mean, I think that one of the quick comments I would make is that if you take a look at South Africa's voting record, for example, you will see that South Africa has consistently, since the new South Africa, since the end of apartheid as we knew it, that South African state has consistently every single year voted against the embargo on Cuba, and is one of the countries, including all of the Global South countries, who have in fact refused to implement non-UN sanctions because of what it means for the people of a country. And we've seen what has happened with Venezuela. 7 million people were displaced as a result of the sanctions on Venezuela. Every single country in the Caribbean is now hosting diaspora from Venezuela for several reasons. One, Venezuela is a neighbor. Two, Venezuela has been a solid friend in need when times were good. Hugo Chavez would be the first one there to help rebuild after hurricane, the first one to offer credits when the price of oil went above $100 a barrel. You know, it's the same relationship which Caribbean folk have with Cuba. You know,
But if I can just say something on that, because I think this is also terribly important. Again, with our partners in the global north, they fail to understand the impact of their own efforts, their own initiatives, policies on us. There's an assumption, and perhaps this is limited in this context just to the Caribbean, where we are wealthy, we are not deserving of development cooperation, we are not even deserving of understanding. So, in the Caribbean, we have had a number of crises which have been generated by action of the global north. You referenced Venezuela, and yet the extent to which there has been a deep understanding by our friends in the global north, resulting in B, concrete, tangible support, has not been shown. And I think, in a sense, it comes back to what is the essence of partnership? How do we? I've been grappling, and this I know is a part of a broader discourse that we hope to have, which is in terms of what have we learned after 50 years of partnership, especially with the European Union, in terms of understanding some of our core, germane, salient, essential interests, and how can we convince our partners of the merit of our claim and therefore the attendant support.
And I would push even further. And this is taking us into uncharted territory in terms of trade. But I would just push further and say it's even deeper than that today, in that once we've had, the crisis here in terms of energy, and we are looking to replace Russian sources of energy with other sources, Maduro is brought in from the cold. He's dusted off, and all of a sudden, Western conglomerates can be back in Venezuela, the taps are turned back on, and the status quo resumes at tremendous cost to the people of Venezuela and the people of Latin America and the Caribbean, quite frankly, And that is a lesson which just seems to escape everybody. If these are the partnerships that we want with the Global South, and we will come to this new sense of agency in the New South that I write and speak about, surely you send the wrong message to the very constituents with whom you want good partnerships. And I find that this is inescapable, and I don't understand how, as part of the conversation today, it's not assimilated into the framework of one, development cooperation, and two, partnerships, which one would think would be, at this point in time, pellucidly clear, But to move on, we now see, we spoke about it just a minute ago, the fact that comparative advantage, low cost, wider choice, which obtained in the different era of trade and globalization, increasingly replaced by more geostrategic, geopolitical issues of concern. But that results in several issues which I would like to have your take on. One is when we take a look at the US IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very strange name for something which is of a different complexion. But when we take a look at it and the EU's response, the Green New Industrial something, I think it's called, right? It's interesting that those subsidies are protectionist, though we don't speak about that, but they are protectionist. The United States speaks explicitly about a small yard, high fence, and that's great, and the EU's following the same thing. But 85% of the rest of the world's people live in non-Western states. When you protect your own turf, essentially, you're leaving the rest up for grabs. And China continues to make huge $1 billion worth of investments recently in Northwest Brazil, $1 billion worth of investments in Turkey, and so on and so forth. So the question I have is this not short-sighted policy from maybe 2 or 3 points? One, in that you leave the rest of the world up for grabs. Two, therefore you limit the domain or the range of play for your own companies. Three, you subject your own consumers to much higher price, right? And four, especially when we take a look at the tariffs for on electric vehicles for China, solar panels, and all of those things, the EU can never reach its targets for 2030. Neither can the United States. When they put 100% in the case of the US and 200% if President Trump is president in November and 40% tariffs on EVs from China, denying the people of the United States and Europe the ability to purchase electric vehicles at least 50% less than they are produced right now. And American companies have written to the White House saying, you know, thank you for the subsidies, and in fact we are producing all of these components, but now we have no markets because we are producing at such a high cost. Nobody wants to buy them. Help us unpick some of this, please.
All right. No, that is indeed, it's an expansive package. There are many elements in that. One of them, obviously, is it shows the almost inherent contradiction in terms of different facets of sustainable development. So we know that there's an economic dimension of sustainable development, there's a social dimension of sustainable development, there's an environmental dimension of sustainable development. And certainly, whether it is the IRA or the Green Deal, these are efforts, state-led efforts aimed at pushing green industrialization. Okay? So there's a recognition that there is an economic opportunity. But at the same time, it is packaged under the respective countries, whether it is members of the EU or the United States, their Paris climate change commitments. I'm not going to question the validity or even the argument that these are consistent or aimed at subscribing to the country's climate change. That's beyond my competence. But what is clear, however, is that there's an internal contradiction. Okay? So you're right in your premise that if a country like the United States were serious about its own climate change aspirations, then it would let China's electric vehicles in. But I would even posit the view that that is not going to happen. That is not how the world economy ticks at all. In fact, just today, just before we started our conversation, I saw on the news ticker that BYD, this Chinese #1 electric vehicle manufacturer, they are investing in Turkey. Okay? Why Turkey? Obviously, very physically proximate to the European Union, but more significantly, Turkey is a member of the customs union, the EU customs union. So this is also a way of circumnavigating the hike in tariffs that the European Union has planned. And again, it calls for evidence-based policies. So that's one. The second point that you made, which is in terms of prices. And here we have to also recognize as a group of countries that export predominantly to the global north, in particular the United States and the European Union. We can benefit. We can. I posit that clearly. We can benefit from high prices. Okay? So for example, cocoa prices have soared. So cocoa in 2014, December 2014, the cost of a ton of cocoa was 3,000, or just over 3,000 US dollars. Earlier this year in April, ironically, at the very time when there was something called the World Cocoa Conference held here in Brussels, cocoa had reached a peak of 12,000 US dollars per ton. Now it is hovering just above 8,000 US dollars per ton. But do you think that the cocoa farmers in Ghana, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Cameroon are benefiting? No, because there's another phenomenon called market structure, where these staggering price increases are being creamed off by intermediaries. You and I come from the Caribbean, but what also unites us, our two countries, is that there was once a time when we were dominant banana exporters. And at the time when I worked a bit in the industry, in the late 90s, in the UK, bananas had switched from being a loss leader, that is a product aimed at luring consumers into the supermarket, and therefore they would be quote unquote trapped and induced to buy other stuff, to the highest profit point in fruits and vegetables. Okay? So that is just 20 years. And again, that's a manifestation of market structure. So unfortunately, precisely because the supermarket chains are very, very heavily concentrated, and we, as in the policymakers, have chosen not to do anything about that. So that's another issue which we have to address, knowing fully well that in terms of sustainable products, whether it is sustainable chocolates, sustainable bananas, fair traded bananas, we can benefit from a higher income. Obviously, if we can get our traceability intact, if we can verify what the conditions under which these products are made. And of course, there's a compliance cost that can be rather onerous. But the other element which I want to raise, though, is this, which is we recently, as an OECPS, developed something which I'm exceedingly proud of, and an exercise which started under my predecessor, Scipion, which is that we have developed a position paper on critical raw materials, because we recognize that there is a huge demand for critical raw materials, most of which are produced in our countries. So if you were to think just in terms of cobalt, recently UNCTAD did some simulation which suggested that between now and 2050, there will be a 1,700% increase in the demand for cobalt. It's the same for lithium, major critical raw materials. So we have an opportunity. And of course, under the Critical Raw Material Act of the European Union, you'd be aware that there is an attempt, a concerted attempt, to try and secure supplies, access to these products. Ironically, I also worked a little bit on post-Cotonou negotiations for the Caribbean. And one of the demands of our European Union friends was to have unfettered access to raw materials. And I've been thinking about this in preparation for our exchange. And I just thought, imagine if we in the Caribbean, or we in the ACP, had said, instead of critical raw materials, we made a demand to the European Union. We want unfettered access to development aid. We want unfettered access to technology. We want unfettered access to vaccination. We want unfettered access to come to Europe and work. Can you imagine just the mere scorn with which that would have been greeted? Okay? And I say that deliberately to underscore a certain comfort that some of our partners have in making demands which are patently unreasonable, and expect us to have a face which suggests that is indeed a very, very legitimate consideration. Final point on this, which in my view is strategic, because our starting point of our conversation was about multilateralism. And again, I've spent more than half of my life engaging with ACP-EU relations, and therefore this is also yet another of my passions. I don't think that there's a deep understanding among our European counterparts that for us it is exceedingly challenging to fully embrace multilateralism in a context where we, 108 countries, I think, between the European Union and the OECPS. We negotiate the Paris Agreement on climate change. And yet, we are then subjected to measures enacted by the European Union in the name of the Paris Agreement on climate change. I'm not convinced as yet that our European friends understand the deep pain that that summons within us.
Now, I was going to ask you to stick a pin there because I do want to ask you about CBAM and the EU New Green Deal.
Sure.
Okay? But we will come to it. But I just have two very short questions because they're bigger things that I want us to get into. One is in a sense, with all the protectionist measures that have gone up in the recent past, is there not an opportunity for us or countries of the global south to consider it's the green light to go back to protectionist measures as well?
No. The answer is no. What I think is, or let me reframe that. I say no, and I still mean no, but I want to add an important, not even a caveat. It's not a caveat. What the recent policy measures, especially those enacted by the global north, but also long-standing by our friends in China, is the supremacy of industrial policy.
Okay.
And so that is what the IRA is about. That is what the Green Deal is about. That is what has catapulted China's economic advance and resulted in one country triggering 800 million people out of poverty. So industrial policy, yes. Tempered tariff liberalization, yes. We are too trade dependent to go the protectionist route. And that's why, again, China has a certain luxury of being able to advance its economic industrialization, because of its size, the terms under which it liberalized, very tempered, the fact that it has had a state-run administration, and of course a long history, but it starts with size. Size matters in economic development, and we don't have that luxury.
What about a country like India?
Size, same,
So,
same, ditto.
okay, all right. So those opportunities would exist for India as well?
Yes,
Okay.
and there's a recent case, and this is also to demonstrate the limits, because Indonesia is possibly the third largest country in Asia. And Indonesia enacted a series of measures with respect to critical raw materials,
Yes.
where it
Yeah.
imposed export bans. And of course, that resulted in other producers, in other exporters coming. So size matters, and we shouldn't discount that.
And I'm going to come to exactly this, right? OPEC-type cartels for CRMs and other sorts of things. But EU New Green Deal, specifically CBAM, right? We saw there are two aspects to this, and we'll move on. The first is that in the recent EU elections, we saw a real pushback by EU voters on issues dealing with the new Green Deal transition. It could very well be that, you know, this has been a period of crisis that has hit everybody's household and pockets in a very deep way. But these are rich countries and relatively rich households that are pushing back and saying no to all of these measures, which have direct implications for them. We saw that with the farmers as well. Okay. At the same time, we get a sense, even from European companies, that CBAM was actually, you know, discussed in the EU Commission and Parliament without the sort of consultation that was required, either internally with European companies, as well as externally with Europe's partners, right? And we've seen countries as disparate as Indonesia on the forest side and deforestation, Australia, India, and others saying they intend to go to the WTO with respect of these policies, which they consider to be protectionist. What is your take on this, particularly for farmers, the agricultural sector in Africa, for example, when we know that EU farmers receive through CAP a direct 50% income subsidy? Now there are higher standards. How does one even compete? And what does a partnership, a genuine mutual gains partnership look like?
Again, you have a tendency, Len, of giving a heavy package, and I feel compelled sometimes to unbundle.
But
Uh,
that's your job. Unpicking is your
yes,
job.
indeed, indeed, indeed. Um, no, it's just that I just don't see it in terms of just narrowing it to CBAM, but the suite of trade and sustainability regulations that the European Union has recently promulgated. So whether it is CBAM, the deforestation regulation, corporate sustainability and due diligence directive, these are all, let's say, under the rubric of the Green Deal. There are two issues, fundamental issues that I have with them. One, obviously, you cannot fault the ambition.
Right.
And that in itself is brilliant because then you are operating in a space which is already defined by your partners because the goal, the objectives are noble. However, there's an issue of extraterritoriality, which again comes back to Helms-Burton and the sanctions imposed on Cuba, for which we have had a long-standing issue, and on which, by the way, the European Union has consistently opposed. So that's the first issue. But the second, and it goes to the core of another element of the question that you posed, is about partnership, because we were never consulted. And if we were consulted, we would have said, certainly with respect to the deforestation regulation, don't tackle or attempt to tackle the appearance of the problem. Tackle the problem. So deforestation in our countries is indeed a reality and an acute problem, but it's a manifestation of something deeper. It's called poverty. Okay? I see the, we in the Caribbean, you have an island, Hispaniola, where aerially you can see the divide between these two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, because one has been denuded of forest and the other not. Okay, so poverty, deal with poverty. And sometimes, unfortunately, we have these measures which are perhaps virtue signaling, but not necessarily effective. So we have already made representation within the WTO. I think that there was even a case involving Indonesia, which the European Union seemed to have won. Now, you might also be aware that within the WTO there is a dysfunctional dispute settlement mechanism, and therefore one has to exercise due caution with which in terms of how much effort one is investing in that realm. But I come back to the core issue for me, which is in terms of the power of consultation. Because if we were consulted, then we would have said, look, we are in full agreement in terms of the aspiration and the objective. However, there are other means necessary. And I come back to the need for us to leverage a partnership which begins, first of all, by us understanding each other. And the us here is in terms of the European Union and the OECPS. Of late, I've tended to say that we recently renewed our marital vows, as in the OECPS and the European Union, and this resulted in the Samoa Agreement. I think on greater reflection, I prefer not to use such lofty terms. And to be a little bit more circumspect in terms of the relationship, but it starts with a deep understanding of each other's interest. But it also requires the OECPS to be clearer in its own development aspiration, in its own vision, to articulate it not only to the European Union, but to other partners, some of whom are sitting in the front row, and to engage accordingly.
I wonder if it might not be perhaps more realistic to say that the OACP and the EU have committed to an open relationship. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good.
That's a good.
That's a better one. Okay. All right. Oh, we agree on that. Other things. There is a sense in many ways that in terms of global South countries, the war in Ukraine and its consequences, its after effects, the sanctions, have been in many ways. I'm not asking that we discuss this. This is just me. A tipping point into global South countries seeking alternative measures to secure their own interests. They've become a lot more transactional. They are rapidly engaged in expanding and building new networks, non-Western networks. The BRICS has been around from 2009, but that is not just expanding, with the UAE and Saudi Arabia bringing quite a lot of investment and other sorts of possibilities, but building institutional architecture within the BRICS, currency reserves and all of those sort of things. Countries in Asia, the ASEAN group, have taken the decision no longer to stockpile the yen, the pound sterling, the US dollars, or the euro, right? They are trading and paying for their trade in local currencies. They're using non-SWIFT payment systems and platforms. There is a steady chipping away at or de-dollarization, which is taking place right now. It's not going to happen overnight. But there are things in place right now which lead us to believe that global South countries are securing alternatives and building their own routes, new trade routes, and investing in each other, very, very importantly. In other words, there is a sense as well, a second point, that middle powers like the Turkey, Brazil's, Indonesia, South Africa, a number of other countries, are in fact seeding what I've been referring to in what I write and speak about, building a multi-layered multipolarity, which is providing greater choice. And that menu of greater choice provokes enormous interest in that it provides more actors and more choice and latitude for partnerships for the global South countries in a way that the EU, the US, and other Western countries should in fact be, if not concerned about, certainly aware about enough to start thinking, what do we need to change in terms of our own narrative? So global South countries are taking steps, fledgling, but deepening all the time, to secure their own interests. What is your view on that? Do you think it's about time? Do you think, why has it taken so long? Do you think this is a step in the right direction? What do you think? And the last thing I will say is that, they're even building their own banks. The new development bank of the BRICS has been around from 2009, but now it is deeper than it ever was. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, built only in 2016, is now the world's second largest multilateral lending institution in the world, right? Seeded by China, but also 154 countries in the world, right? So what are we seeing? We've seen alternative pathways. Is that a good thing? What do you make of this?
Well, the last 30 years of liberal economics has taught us that choice is a good thing.
Good.
No? But, but to expand on that, there is indeed a recognition that there's a disruption in the global political system. In fact, again, in reflecting on our chat, there was a time when some of the hegemonic powers would believe, or would openly state, that it is in their national interest that countries of the global South subscribe to multilateralism.
Yeah.
That was their national interest, okay? Obviously, we have veered away from that, where there is this on the one hand, deepened economic co-dependence, but on the other hand, the rise of economic nationalism. So there's a tension that is there. But I think, though, it goes deeper than that, which is obviously China has emerged as a major developing partner, and not only in terms of a source of development assistance, but also in terms of an inspiration for industrialization. Within the WTO, China has been a very, very strong supporter of developing countries' interest. We know through the G77 plus China that there has been a strong political engagement, especially anchored in New York. So we, as an OECPS, we have had this long-standing political partnership with the European Union, but even within the parameters of the Samoa Agreement, there's a recognition of the power of South-South cooperation. And in fact, that if we were to act as a bridge between the European Union and other southern partners, then we could harness the power of South-South cooperation. But the opportunities are beyond just, let's say, these institutional frameworks, important as they are, and they're burgeoning. They are in their nascent form. They go into the realm, for example, of development policy. They go into the realm of regional integration. Everyone knows that the European Union has always been ecumenical about its regional integration model, and sought to spread the gospel in its engagement with developing countries. And yet, you referenced earlier ASEAN. ASEAN has a radically different regional integration model, less institutionalized, less bureaucratic. It, in a sense, follows the money. The Pacific Alliance has recently emerged, a group of countries which is physically discontiguous, and yet they are propelling towards regional integration because they focus on very specific areas of cooperation. One of the challenges and one of the deep regrets that we have had, certainly within the Caribbean, is the European Union and the Caribbean are neighbors, and yet there's a wall dividing us. So you're from St. Lucia. Probably you would have spent, as a lot of your compatriots have, in neighboring islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and yet access to those countries is exceedingly problematic. We don't seem to understand that there is one Caribbean, yes, divided by languages, but that there is almost a hermetical seal, not only with respect to the movement of people, but the movement of goods, the movement of services. It's expressed also in terms of the poverty of transportation links. So that is, there are some basic elementary steps that we need to undertake. I'm talking here within the context of the European Union and the OECPS, which could propel our development aspirations, but we seem bent on not taking them. To come back to this question in terms of opportunities, I might be old-fashioned, but forgive me by suggesting that this is an opportunity for us to return to the spirit of the mid-70s, the spirit. What transpired then? That was a world where in 1973, there was an oil crisis. There was an oil crisis triggered by the Yom Kippur War, and a number of Middle Eastern oil exporters imposed an embargo. And the power of OPEC was born. One of the consequences of that was a quadrupling of oil prices from $3 per barrel to $12 per barrel. The importance of that simple geostrategic event with staggering implications for the global economy, because one of the consequences was stagflation and reduced economic growth. In fact, the global economy went into decline. Heavily informed something that later transpired, which was in 1975, the Lomé Agreement. Why did that inform it? Because the European Union was highly, then Europe called the European Economic Community, was sensitized to the need to have unfettered access to basic raw materials. And so one of the manifestations of a novelty of Lomé was not only to overturn what was euphemistically called reverse preferences. Do you know what reverse preferences are? You remember what reverse preferences were?
Are these different to special and differential preferences?
It is definitely different to special and differential
before
treatment. Before mine too. All right, so the Yaoundé Convention had enshrined something called reverse preferences, which basically meant whatever preferences, trade and investment preferences, the European Union gave its ex-colonies, these ex-colonies were required to grant same treatment to Europe. Lomé overturned that by having non-reciprocal market access, but also special commodity protocols. So I referenced earlier the bananas. Sugar protocol was significant because one of the elements of the sugar protocol was not only having access to above world market prices, but the European Union acted as the guarantor, the last buyer. So if you were unable to sell your sugar in any part of the world, the European Union would buy it for you. There was something called Stabex, which meant that if your export prices were depressed, not solely by selling to the United States, but anywhere, by selling to the European Union, but anywhere in the world, Stabex would ensure that your economy did not suffer, and in particular your fiscal receipts. These were revolutionary times.
Yet the United States, on behalf of Chiquita and Dole, the United States, on behalf of Chiquita and Dole, was able to kill Windward Island banana industry, even though it represented 0.004% of global production of bananas. But also, I mean, small amounts, but in a country like Dominica, it was 60% of exports, 50% of labor, right?
And it's important to register why that happened. Why that happened is because the various iterations of Lomé, from Lomé 1 to Lomé 4, then quote-unquote graduating into Cotonou, meant a transition away from something that was revolutionary, informed by UNCTAD, by the way, which celebrated its 60th anniversary last month, that one of the elements that infused the partnership between the European Union and the OECPS, conditionalities, whether it is in terms of human rights, broader issues of governance, but conditionalities also because that was the high time of the Washington Consensus. So again, it is showing how this partnership, which was revolutionary, was robbed of its essence over time. And I would urge us to go back to that spirit of being radical, of being bold. And I'll give you one example. It would be highly remiss of me. Any public event that I participate in, everyone would be assured that I'm going to make this same proposal, just to underscore the need for a radical solution. And by the way, this is not even radical. It's called skills partnership. I first mooted this in 2016 after the Brexit referendum, where the UK government invited me to give them some ideas of what could constitute an independent UK trade policy with respect to developing countries. And at that time, I even had a name for this because it was called, I dubbed it the Mary Seacole Initiative, after the great Jamaican nurse, Mary Seacole. Skills partnership. So, We know that there's a demographic crisis in Europe. In fact, broadly in the global north. Um, in contrast, there's a demographic dividend in Africa in particular. Okay? So one would have thought that it makes perfect sense for there to be skills partnership, at least between Europe and Africa, where my proposal was built on nurses, because as you know, we have seen our nurses being poached by and teachers by the global north, uncompensated. This is a classic case of the poor subsidizing the rich. Because the fact of the matter is that the cost of training a nurse in Europe is significantly higher than that in the Caribbean. So, what my proposal would do in the first instance, ensuring that we get European investment to increase the stock of nurses that are trained in the Caribbean so that we can satisfy our own demand. This is about connecting the dots. There's a WHO initiative which is led by Jamaica on the I think it's called the International Protocol on the Ethical Procurement of Health Professionals, something of that nature. It is connected to an EU document called the Global Public Health Strategy, where there is a reference buried in that document to labor mobility. It is connecting a dot to the State of the Union address made by the President of the European Commission in 2023, September, which recognizes the need for labor mobility. It is connecting the dot to a provision in the Caribbean Regional Protocol appended to the Samoa Agreement. And the significant element in terms of development aspiration, development potential, is that we can, with this improved stock of nursing training in the Caribbean, for example, but not limited, we can invite EU nationals to come and be trained at market prices in terms of tuition fees, funded by Horizon 2020, I think that's the name of it. And of course, that then triggers a virtual cycle, because by having people, European nationals, coming to the Caribbean, be trained, they are consuming a whole host of services. But most importantly, they are also applying a great European concept called social cohesion, because they are coming to the region, understanding our culture. They go back, whether it is to Poland, Denmark, Croatia, Slovenia, wherever, and they want to consume Caribbean goods, Caribbean rice and peas, Caribbean jerk marinade, patties, etc., music,
Yeah.
dance,
Yeah.
clothing, musical instruments. I'm winking at the Bahamian ambassador there. So,
It's a breach of protocol, you know, to do that.
apologies. I shouldn't wink.
Okay.
I shouldn't
No,
wink.
you shouldn't. You
But
should do
but
that in
but
private.
but the most important element is just a demonstration of the need for us to be
Yeah.
radical. And to be honest, I am staggered that we are not rushing to make this happen.
Yeah.
And that compels me to be a bit concerned, but I will yield.
Yeah. My friend, interestingly, we've been on for an hour. There's still a couple of things that I wanted to go through, but we need to invite our friends to participate. But there's one last point. I will leave the others, but one last thing that I will say. All of the countries that are represented by the OACP and the countries of the Global South generally, what they want is the ability to move up the value chain, right? They want to move away from the extraction of raw materials. They want value added at home. And it's interesting that after decades of exporting oil, that Nigeria has always imported petroleum-based products for its own use. And for the first time, after many, many, many years, it now has in hand a 19 billion investment to to, you know, establish its first refinery that will refine something like over 600,000 barrels of oil a day. But that took decades. And I tie that to the 1970s and the experience of your own country in the name of Michael Manley, who, when Alco and Alcan were in fact extracting bauxite, and Jamaica was reinvesting, re-importing, you know, aluminum products at more than 1,000% value added. And he made the point, you know, that there were people in the countryside in Jamaica who were illiterate. I remember at the time medical students at Mona being, you know, having to spend an internship period in the clinics in rural areas to provide primary care as part of getting a medical degree from Mona. That didn't go down well with the United States and the West, generally speaking, and Henry Kissinger is famous for having said, bring the economy to its knees. And, you know, I mean, in the early 70s, one Jamaica dollar was valued at $2. Within 8 years, it was 180 Jamaican dollars, right, to $1. And it has taken Jamaica a long time to recover. It has never really recovered the currency exchange, right? So, where do we go from here? You know I'm asking something tough, but I want to invite our colleagues and friends here to weigh in. Where do we go in from here? We see the EU right now all over parts of Africa, certainly not maybe right now, but a year ago, asking Nigeria, Angola, other countries to in fact pump more oil, the very industry that the EU is looking to kill. And we all know that you need a good 40 years investment to be able to make good on new investments, right? Africans are concerned about holding on to stranded assets. In 5 years, when the crisis is gone, who is going to buy these assets from them, at what price, and what do they do with their own development needs? Where do we go from here? And then let's invite our colleagues and friends here to maybe take us to some areas where you and I have not yet discussed.
Indeed. All right, thanks for that. Let me address it by looking at what we have done on critical raw materials. We started, this exercise actually began thanks to the European Union, in the sense that they had promulgated at that time what was known as the CRM legislation, and we felt compelled to respond, because not only is the European Union a major trading partner, and they were basically crafting policies aimed at our wealth of critical raw materials, but we also recognized instantly there was a tremendous opportunity for our countries, especially those that are rich in critical raw materials, to catapult their economies onto a different trajectory. So, the key elements of that strategy are as follows. One, recognizing that we're developing a strategy not for any particular trading partner. Yes, the exercise might have been triggered by what the European Union did, but we felt that it was important that we were neutral with respect to its application. Why? Because in the first instance, it was about our development aspirations. So that is the first. The second was recognizing that critical raw materials, they straddle so many different fields. So in the first instance, they were recognizing that this was a value chain, and that is also important as a trade economist, seeing that it impacts a whole host of different economic sectors. And yet, through revising our strategy, one of the elements that we became important, and it comes back to a starting point of our discussion, which is in terms of disruption and the global political environment, is that critical raw materials, the conjunction, is almost as if it's a composite product, because it represents the conjunction of technology, of defense, of geostrategic partnerships or interests, of politics, of diplomacy, of environment, and of course of trade. So we had to treat it holistically. Okay? So that, in my view, is a model of how we want to move forward, because of course we recognize that there is this thrust towards industrialization, beneficiation, value addition, and therefore to harness the promise of critical raw materials, we had to treat it holistically. By treating it holistically, it also means, as you know perfectly well, any extractive industry is predicated on a sustained and reliable source of energy. So it's also an opportunity to tap into renewable energy. I saw recently some data from IRENA, and I can't instantly recount them right now, but the power, the potential power that resides in Africa with respect to geothermal power, solar power, hydroelectric power. This has the genuine opportunity of powering our economies. And therefore, in the first instance, while we are trade dependent and we fully recognize that there is a rush towards critical raw materials, we are not interested in this becoming a new commodity rush. That is important, because that is the reason why we have remained underdeveloped, or at least not realized our development potential. That's the first. The second is, of course, we are interested in supporting the European transition, green and digital transition. But forgive me, we are primarily interested in our own digital and green transition.
I would have to agree. Colleagues and friends, here we are. You've been absolutely wonderful for this hour with us. And I am hoping that you do have remarks, comments, questions that you would please.
Now, first of all, I would like to...
Excuse me, can we have a mic, please? Or, yeah.
I can start with this one. Now, first of all, thank you for inviting, and also congratulations for this, I would say, rare discussion, because I think it's really the heart of what we all are doing here in Brussels, in this, discussion between the European Union and the world. So I think it was a brilliant conversation. I'd like to come back to a few points that you mentioned. First, you started to say trade has really benefited the developing countries up to the last few years, because it's true that a part of the world has very much benefited from the trade. But if you look carefully, most of those who have benefited, particularly in Asia, were not resource rich. They benefited because they really added value and sold sophisticated product at a high price. Why is that so important? Because the more you add value, the more you sophisticate your production, it means that you need more qualified people, specialized worker, qualified worker, engineers, and then you need all the services around transportation, bank, insurance, communication, research, and that's what we call industrialization. But if you look at Africa, for example, at the time when almost the whole of Asia was really moving up the value chain, not remaining at the basics of value chain, but climbing the value chain, in Africa has continued to sell its basic products, agricultural products or mining products. So it's not about trade. Trade is important, but it's what you trade. And this is about industry and the value addition. And during this time, if you look at, I should show a figure, have a very nice slide on this. You look at the evolution of value addition since 1990, and you see that Europe and the US have decreased by half of their contribution to worldwide value addition. Africa has remained the same. It's almost, you know, Africa trade is 2.7% of the world trade. Singapore alone is 6%, a small island. So you see, and that explains many things. That comes back to a second point that you mentioned. There was a contradiction between new trade rule, you say protectionism, and the objective of the transition to climate action and protecting the environment. But the reality, if you look at Europe and the US, you have had social unrest because having decreased their contribution to the global production of industrial products, you have the unrest in unrest. I mean, relative, but you have, you know, groups now that are suffering from this. And the same in Europe. You had the Brexit, you had the Gilets jaunes, you had the Trump, the Rust Belt, and including in France, you know, just you saw this social unsatisfaction. So it means that each country, whether you're in developing country, whether you're already advanced country, need to have a certain minimum of production. You cannot be only consumers, because how do you pay the product that you consume? You need to produce also highly sophisticated products that to sell a high price for your people to have a purchase power. So it means that industry is central for any country for the prosperity. At the same time, we know that in the whole process of production has contributed to pollution and to climate change. So it means that is where we need to do the transition. And most of the solution for the transition will come from industry. It's the electric vehicles, all the things, the digitalization, everything. It will not come from the sky. It will come from engineers who are trying to invent new products with less impact on the environment and the climate. So we need, and this is where we need, maybe that's the bridge, not only between EU and ACP countries, but in the world, because we still need to have a bridge. We need first to agree on the high standards and norms to respect the environment and social norms, but also we need to invest so that everyone can have access to those technologies and capacities, because everyone needs not only to be a consumer, but also, as you're saying, we want in the Caribbean to also produce our own growth, have access to this digitalization, etc. So my point, and that would be my conclusion, I think that if we have to fight for something, is really to make sure that we have a real industrial diplomacy, industrial cooperation, so that we exchange knowledge, technologies, and capacity for each one to have at least a minimum, maybe 20% of industry in their GDP, because below this, it's the crisis. Thank you.
I will thank you so very much for this. I'll invite Junior to respond, and then maybe take 2 or 3 more, and then rather than each one. But it's just that Christophe has mentioned quite a lot of, you thought I'm dense, but he's mentioned a number of things. Just a quick few things that I would say. One is that
I'm Christophe Yvetot. I represent the United Nations Industrial Development Organization.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've raised a number of very, very important questions, issues, comment. I would push back and say, you say we should all have high standards. I would ask you, who pays? You said technology, yes, technology transfer is something that Global South countries have been asking for. There's got to be a mechanism for, in fact, making sure that that's the case. I suspect that when you've spoken about trade, you know, and the unrest and the sense of unease in the Rust Belt in the United States, yes, but when you take a look at the balance sheet of trade for the United States, it's balanced off by trade and services. So trade is not just about goods and manufacturing. We talk about high-level technology that allows services to be a huge bundle of the basket of tradables today. But Junior, I'll ask you to respond, and then we take 3, 4 comments and then handle them in tranches.
All right, thank you very much. And thanks to Christophe. Christophe, with his question, confirmed why I invited him. So I'm grateful for that. But let me just quickly respond, which is, in a sense, goes back to the last point that I'd made, which is for us to go back to the spirit of the 70s, the spirit, not to go back to the 70s, but the spirit of the 70s, which is to be radical. And while I trumpet the essence of the Lomé Convention, for example, in terms of trying to be radical, there was an inherent contradiction, and I'm saying that deliberately, an inherent contradiction at the heart of Lomé. Because on the one hand, it was seeking to promote industrialization, so that it wasn't just in terms of duty-free, quota-free access to the European market, but also there were specific interventions in terms of business development support. There was something called the CDE, or CDI, I think it was called first, and then later renamed the CDE. So a deliberate attempt to move up the value chain. But that was contradicted by the access to the special commodities. So what it did in net was to render the OECPS and the EU to be locked into what was described by a former EU Commissioner of Trade as a colonial terms of trade, where we are exporting commodities, especially agricultural and mineral, and we are importing industrialized products, and that has not changed. To the contrary, the 2021 UNCTAD Trade and Development Report suggested that commodity dependence is stronger than ever before. And in fact, 45 of the 53 African countries were commodity dependent, and commodity dependence is here defined by having 60% of your export receipts from commodities. So that is where we are, unfortunately. And again, it zeroes in on our inability to just focus on what the data is telling us and what the interventions that are required. I'm very much familiar, as you know, with a lot of the work that UNIDA does. And there was a UNIDA report on industrialization 4.0, where, for example, it was citing what the Dominican Republic was doing, benefiting from specific industrialization arrangements with Spain, for example. And now you read reports suggesting that the Dominican Republic has aspirations of becoming an OECD country. Now, that might not necessarily transpire today, possibly not tomorrow, but it shows what a very, very strong development objective and aspiration, and in a context, and this is important because I must confess I'm a huge fan of this country. I worked on EPA negotiations for the Caribbean. The Dominican Republic was able to liberalize 95% of its imports from the European Union. Why? Because it had previously negotiated something called CAFTA. Okay? So it was already an open economy. Now the DR is more competitive than ever before. Final point, I like what you just said, which is in terms of, let's say, you call it an industrialization diplomacy or strategy, which again underscores what I'd said, which is industrial policy is back. And I think that we need to not only recognize that, but seize it. So thanks for that.
Thank you. I mean, one of the last things that I would just add to that is that, you know, when we took a look at the negotiations for post-Cotonou arrangements, it was quite clear that what the African membership of the OACP was after was a clear strategy to industrialization. a clear path, which they never had. It's no wonder that today you look at Indonesia that has put a ban on the export of its nickel. You've taken a look at Latin America. There are 3 countries that have put together OPEC-type cartel to deal with mining and adding value in their part of the world and exporting to the rest of the world. These are models, I think, to emulate, but it's not by chance. It's because there is a wariness in Global South countries that this period might pass them by too if they're not astute and alert to the opportunities as well as the challenges. But we have this gentleman, and then secondly, this gentleman, and then we have others, please. So we'll take maybe 3, 4 questions, and then I'll invite Junior to comment.
Thank you very much indeed for your enriching dialogue upstage. My name is Wolfgang Pape. I was an EU diplomat in Washington and Tokyo and was with the institution more than 30 years here. And I have a very simple question. You associated yourself with the global south. You used the terminology several times. I didn't count it. What is the global south? For me, the south as such already is very diverse. But the global south is even more difficult to put together in a group. Could you define it or give me members? Because as a European, you know, we try to cross borders now. Is it possible within the global south as well? Thank you.
Sure. Let's take this gentleman and then...
Karel Uitendaele, former employee from the Belgian Employees Federation and Chief of Staff of Secretary of State ICT in Belgium here. How to make sure that the whole society, the whole of European society understands it's to our advantage that Africa gets industrialized and the other countries. We don't understand it, we don't know it. We believe that Africa is not yet ready for industrialization. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Michel de Kemeter of Club of Brussels. I'm the inventor with the think tank of a new economic model which we are testing in worldwide. And we have experiences here in the West and also in the global South, as you said. And I'm quite shocked actually when I heard the Hispaniola island, which is deforestation is like a signal of poverty. And we have the opposite example, opposite experience. We have, for example, an experience in war zone, and we know why in the DRC. The reforestation in agroforestry and in permaculture creates actually abundance and wealth. We have seen tens of thousands of families going out of poverty in 2 months of time, in 2 months' time. So reforesting, if it's done well, helps people to go out of poverty. And we have the same stories in Tanzania, the same stories now in Latin America. So it's the opposite. I've also heard very strange stories about and seen very strange stories especially in Africa. NGOs and so-called corporations who are there since decennia doing stuff, and or it's incompetence or it's done on purpose to keep the people away from the knowledge to grow out of what you said and to access basic level of and really I have stories, you don't believe them, and I will not tell them here, it will take us too long, but it's really shocking. Or it's on purpose to keep a whole continent which is very rich in very precious metals that we need for our economy, and it's not in our advantage at all to get that country out of poverty, so we keep them on, or it's incompetence. In both cases, I think it's a sin against intelligence. Huh? Okay? And also, and afterwards, when we were on the field, and we are maybe very naive, and we are very performant. We are outperforming the whole, for example, cooperation in Kinshasa, in terms of performance and reforestation and getting people without carbon credits, with no money, just knowledge, reforesting and et cetera, and agroforestry and all these subjects. People, the poorest people in the country, in the world, telling me, you know, these NGOs that come for a few months throwing bags of rice to us, actually do more harm than good. We should learn, like you do, to create small businesses to become autonomous from that. So actually, this Global South story, this whole subject of today, I'm surprised I didn't hear anything of that tastes like that. On maybe the tables will turn. You know, in the West, and I will conclude with this, we are in an old continent, Europe and North America, and actually it's very old. It's getting over the board. We are now getting more and more poor, more and more indebted, and in front of the biggest challenges in history, which we can't solve. We have proven with the UN SDGs, the West is not able to solve those problems at all, even with our thousands of billions. And when I see the intelligence in that called Global South, where they can do everything with so little, and we have everything and we can't do it, maybe the tables will turn.
Thank you. Thank you. This gentleman, and then our friend there.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lodge. It was a pleasure listening to you. And I come from another cricket-playing nation, which is Pakistan. And we have more fans of Courtney Walsh and Chris Gayle than you have in Jamaica, I can assure you. So I have a very simple question that, you know, we, in Pakistan, we have a huge population, 250 million people. And we had the least of contribution to the damage to the planet. Whereas we are the 6th most vulnerable country when it comes to climate. So in this, you know, in this landscape, now EU is coming up with regulations which are climate related, which are going to affect trade, and in a product which is very close to our heart, and maybe I hate to admit that, but we are a single product country when it comes to trade, which is textiles. And in textiles, you know, EU is coming up with a host of regulations in the name of climate, which is going to seriously challenge our ability to export to Europe. So being climate victims and then becoming subjected to regulations which is going to further limit our trade, what do you suggest? How should Pakistan go about it? And what type of coalition partners can we find to, you know, negotiate our way through this? Thank you.
Thank you. And then our friend here, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ASG, for the very fascinating presentation. My name is Senvi. I'm from the Republic of Liberia, and I'm also the focus president at the OECPS. And I like the fact that you mentioned the 1975 Georgetown and to our current Samoa Agreement. So I'd like to talk about West Africa in regards to what's unfolding with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And we have a common market in West Africa. And unfortunately, the 3 countries have decided to back off from ECOWAS, calling themselves the Alliance for Sahel States. So how does it affect, and you know, the fact that we family from the OECPS, so this is coming from a more academic point of view, how does it affect our common market system in ECOWAS, the fact that we move towards that stage? Thank you.
Okay, we have several comments and a number of questions. Just to recap, what is the Global South? What does it mean? Is Africa ready? The issue of Haiti and the benefits of reforestation. Bags of rice don't help. Issues, Pakistan, textile, new standards, and then of course that of West Africa's REX, the Regional Economic Community. If I could just tackle only a definition of the Global South,
with pleasure,
and then ask you to deal with all the others. A couple of quick things. One is that if we take a look back at the definitions, you know, during the period of the Cold War, there were three worlds. The first world was defined as the capitalist world. The second world was the communist world. And the third world was the rest of the world, mostly poor, former colonies or colonies at that time. Incidentally, many of those countries in the third world were members of the non-aligned movement at that time. They were also members of the Pan-African movement of the 60s, 50s, and 60s, and earlier than that, with a very clear agenda to do several things: to end apartheid, to deal with civil rights, and to end colonialism. And they were poor countries. China was not a member of the Global South, but China has always been an ally, and today China is a superpower and still an ally of those countries. But China was always engaged in solidarity with those countries. So when Tanzania in the early 50s became one of Africa's first independent countries, the president went to the United States and asked for financing to build the first railroad to bring ore commodities from the hinterland to ports and then benefit from global trade. He was told where to get off. He went to the UK and he was told, you know, you're a poor country. There's no way that you'll be able to pay this debt. And then he was in touch with China. And the chairman said, but we're as poor as you. He said, yes, but there's something called friendship and solidarity. The Chinese, in 1969, started to build, with their money and their workers, the first railroad in Tanzania. They finished in 1971. It cost $1 billion. At today's cost, that's $8-9 billion. Was it Taiwan or China? China built it. No, China built that railroad. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, today we hear that China is the new colonialist on the continent of Africa. China has been a friend for a very, very long time, hundreds of years even before this story. There was a particular time in history where India and China were the world's two most important economies. They're reascending to a certain place that they held. When we take a look at global economic output, that is shifting from west to east. In 1960, the United States was responsible for 48.2% of global output. By 1990, that was down much less than that. By 2000 and 2021, that was 25%. China, 20 years ago, had a GDP of about 1 trillion. It's 18 trillion in 20 years against the United States 25 trillion. It will be the world's first largest economy by 2030. India is moving up the ranks. It will soon be number 3. Indonesia by 2045 will be the world's third largest economy, and so on and so forth. And these countries are shifting bundles of economic power into political power on the global stage. And that's what makes the difference today. So whereas we were talking about third world a long time ago, and then the World Bank came in with its own GDP per capita income-based stratification of least developed, developing, and all of those sort of things, then we settled into the parlance of the Global South. And the Global South, many people don't recognize this, is a terminology that has been in use for the last 30 years. Since the implosion, the diminished capacity of the Soviet Union, right? When the Soviet Union as an empire sort of disappeared, that term, third world, suddenly fell into disuse, and we just discussed with everybody, you know, this new terminology, Global South. It became popular. The mistake I think we make is to seek perfection in terms of concepts. It is interesting that when we say the West, everybody understands. We know the West includes Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia. These are not countries in the north. These are countries geographically in the south. When we speak about the global south, we are speaking about two things in particular. It's not about geography, it's not about geographic location. It is about solidarity, a sense of shared grievances, a sense of a common vision for the future based on certain important things. One, a diffusion of global power. Two, multilateral institutional reform, and so on and so forth and so forth. Okay, I could give you a whole, it happens I just came from Bonn where I spoke about these things, so I remember some of this. But I'm just saying that the fact of imperfection should not diminish the utility of certain concepts. And in any event, you know, practice is also important. Concepts are important. Practice is also important. We can get bogged down in terminology and making sure that the nuances are right without understanding that, in fact, there is utility in what we have. And the last thing that I will say is that today we talk about the New South. And the New South, why? Because these countries are much more powerful on the global stage than they ever were before. They're seeking their own interests, transactional or not. They have the economic power and increasingly the political power to devise alternatives to the status quo right now. They are contesting Western-based norms of governance and leadership. And they are chipping away at the institutional architecture and the status quo that we have right now. That is the New South. And that's why we say the New South, because there's a new agency which they're using to secure their own interests.
One word on that, because I recognize that that is definitely a speciality of yours. There's an article in The Economist, in the latest edition of The Economist, by the Finnish president, where he's pleading for Europe to suspend its primary articulation and embrace, if not export, of values, and recognize that it has interest in the global south. And that I find an interesting recognition, because it speaks also to, let's say, the shift that we see also in the von der Leyen presidency, where she recognizes that there are these geostrategic interests that the European Union has. And I sense that there's a certain tension that is emerging from a European Union which has traditionally been very strident in the articulation of values to one where there are strategic interests. And one example that interests me of this seeming tension is that, as I'd said before, the European Union has always been the largest proponent of regional integration, precisely because it is the embodiment of regional integration. And so, of course, that was the predicate on which EPAs were negotiated, economic partnership agreements were negotiated in the attempt to dynamize the respective regional integration processes in ACP regions. And yet, recently, the most recent iteration of an economic partnership agreement is actually with a country. I see a Kenyan here in the audience, is with Kenya. And Kenya is nominally a part of a customs union called the EAC. It would be unspeakable if Germany, I suspect from the name either that you're German or Austrian, but I don't, you're European, I don't want to out you. All right, thank you. That it would be unthinkable if Germany were to seek to establish a trade agreement with Japan, being a member of the European Union. It's indeed, exactly. And strictly speaking, it should not be legally possible either for Kenya to do likewise. But I understand the point. Why I say that is because there is this tension, which is very palpable, and which constrains countries such as ours, which I would call institutionally conservative, meaning that we don't respond, we don't have the, I would even argue, the institutional capacity to address the mountain of changes that the European Union generates. And so there's always this kind of gap for us to, A, understand what the European Union is enacting with respect to its legislatory, if not regulatory, agenda, and to respond to that. But let me come back just briefly because I sense that I could talk for hours on that. Is Africa ready for industrialization? Yes, it is, but we do not know it. Here is what I think. I'm not 100% sure about that. I think that you know it, but you don't dare say it. Because we talk about China, and I come from the Caribbean. We have had a long history of working with the United States. The United States, Wolfgang spoke about being in DC. One of the attributes for us in the Caribbean about the United States is that they are never hesitant of saying what they want. And in fact, they will even package it and say, it's in your interest to give us what we want. Okay? That's the experience that we have made. In Europe, it is almost indecent to say what you want. So you have to spend copious amount of time, hours, deciphering what Europe wants. So I generally believe that Europe understands the economic power and potential of Africa. There was a 3-line study, I think it was called, by one of these big think tanks that suggested that Africa, by 2030, would have a GDP equivalent to France. Now, France is a member of the G7. Okay. Whether that will be realized within that timetable remains to be seen, because of course one of the motors of that was, one, the commodity boom, which we have spoken about before, which has of course resulted in commodity dependence as opposed to moving up the value chain, and the second was the full implementation of the African Continental FTA, and there are still some severe gaps in that. So, but the potential is there. Under Juncker, there was indeed this Alliance for Jobs. I'm using the short name for that. And again, I don't know what has transpired with respect to that initiative, or even whether it worked or not. But of course, the treatment of Africa is always, in a sense, channeled through one particular lens, either with in terms of fragile states or a source of illegal migration. And that does not, in my view, allow Europe to see the full potential of Africa and truly act on it. There was a reference made to both deforestation and NGOs. The NGOs I will leave out, but just for clarity, the point that I was making is that in a number of instances, deforestation is a reflection of poverty. It is not that reforestation would not generate economic development, but simply that we have seen strong evidence whereby forests have fallen in order to fuel, if I can use that term, whether it is charcoal, so, the evidence is very, very, very clear. Of course, I fully recognize the power of agroforestry. That is something, for example, a number of our countries are grappling with, and we're actually working with the FAO in terms of developing OECPS agroforestry in a number of instances. And here again, for example, you see this conjunction between climate change and trade, because a country like Cameroon, its cocoa plantation coexists with forests. And there's a major challenge in terms of traceability, in terms of satellite surveillance to prove that forests have not been damaged there. There was I like the question with respect to Pakistan. And let me also return the favor, because I'm a huge fan of the Pakistani cricket team, because like the West Indies, we are flamboyant, but unfortunately also like the West Indies, we tend to fail at the last hurdle. We almost contrive to lose cricket matches when they're within the clutch of victory as such. So unfortunately, that's something which I truly register with our Pakistani friends. But certainly in terms of cotton, here's how I'll answer the question. Because if I think of the sources of trade injustice, cotton is the most egregious. And forgive me if I take a slight bend on this one, which is there are 4 LDCs, West African LDCs. They're called the C4. They've now been joined by Cote d'Ivoire, so they're called the C5. But these 4 countries are the 4 poorest countries in Western Africa. And they have been suffering under domestic support measures used by major trading partners. And by major trading partners, let me specifically name China and the United States, which has resulted in cotton prices being suppressed. And therefore, they are unable to compete as effectively as they would like to, because of course, the farmers in these jurisdictions are benefiting from massive domestic support. Oh, I take that as a signal that I'm talking too long. And yet, since the launch of the Doha Development Agenda, we, as in the global community, have said we are going to address this. And what has transpired is there are 2 tracks, a trade track and a development cooperation track. The development cooperation track is far more promising than the trade track, because the trade track requires an agreement among, I think now there are 166 WTO members, to agree to not to use domestic support on agriculture, okay? And in particular in cotton, just on cotton. And so what we have are countries that are pumping development aid in order to rectify the problem, when the remedy is far better and cheaper. And in a way, that's a strong, powerful message, not to be seduced by the offer of development aid, but to get policies right. So that's how I would want to address this cotton issue that, for me, it's a flagship of trade injustice that we need to address. If I may just veer off a little bit, because one of the second forms of injustice, and forgive me if I can underscore this, the issue that separates the Caribbean from the European Union is something called tax governance. I'm not looking at the Bahamian ambassador. It would be impolite to do that. Where the European Union, again, in its articulation of extrajudicial or extraterritorial treatment, believes that it should be the guardian and policeman on tax governance, on measures enacted by an organization that we are not party to. We are not members of. Those rules are subscribed elsewhere, but imposed on us, and we are invited regularly to say, tell me how you intend to implement these measures that we have imposed. Okay? And again, I come back to this query about how do you expect us to embrace multilateralism when this is a patent disregard of multilateralism, all right? So there are so many elements to unpack. I'm adopting your approach here. So whenever the European Union establishes these, what they call A lists or B lists, okay? Blacklist or gray list, officially that's what it is called. It writes a member of the General Secretariat of the Council writes to a head of government. Now, just that alone is egregious. Just that alone. It would be unheard of, absolutely unheard of, for the reverse to transpire. And again, our European friends just do not get it, how painful just that act alone is. That's one. The second, it makes its assessment. We're not party to that assessment. We're not invited to even offer comments and say, hey, look, no, this is the procedure, this is what we have done. No, we're just written to. So that's the spirit of partnership, which is compromised. The third element is that the rules have so been crafted that the biggest users of tax havens will never be on that list. The biggest user of tax haven is a very, very small jurisdiction. And I'll give you a hint. It's not in the Caribbean.
It's off the shores of the United Kingdom.
No. Sorry to disappoint you. It's Delaware. It's Delaware. It's Delaware. Okay? But the rules have so been crafted that it is deemed, and here's the irony again. I forget the name, but there is something, let's say, a mutual agreement on corporation, on tax corporation, yeah, which is to which all OECD members have to subscribe to. The United States has never subscribed to that, and yet, the rule says the United States is deemed to have complied with tax rules. The final example is this. There's a country, I think the first list came out in 2017, I think. And there's a particular country, which I will not name, which has been on that list ever since. It's on the grey list. I promise you, it will never graduate to that list, to the blacklist. Never. Because the political ramifications are too grave. And therefore, when our European friends come and tell us that this list has been established in a very, very fair and thorough, legitimate exercise. Sorry? Autonomous indeed and fair. Take a deep breath. Okay. No, but like one final response, which is I like the question that was posed because in a sense, again, there are many different tales in that question. So again, regional integration. 2 weeks ago, I was at a seminar where I listened to two of the ministers from the alliance, and I sense that, of course, this act of establishing the alliance of Sahel states is in itself a response to the ECOWAS response. That is one. Second, this exercise in the Sahel, to put it mildly, is also an act of decolonization. I might not necessarily agree with the means these countries are deploying, but when one establishes the grievances or the issues that they are trying to grapple with, it is notable the silence with respect to the provisions, the agreements that these countries were exposed to that heavily constrained their sovereignty. And so it is not a wonder that you have had this kind of reprise. Now, one could argue that if the alliance of Sahel states were to become a truly integrated process, whether it is in terms of a political integration, there is even a talk of a confederation. I don't know whether it is an economic push or not, that could allow for smoother reintegration into ECOWAS. Perhaps that's the more positive, if not rose-tinted perspective. But I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Junior. Thank you very much, all of you. I think that we have canvassed a few of what we might call shared grievances in this particular time of turbulence and tension, and spoken a little bit to why there are alternative pathways that are now being explored by the rest of the world. I think that when the sanctions on Russia were first imposed and then different rounds were in fact acted on, when the West looked behind and saw that the rest of the world had not simply fallen in line, I think was the beginning of the need for a particular period of reflection and conversation. And yet still one gets the sense that certainly in Brussels, certainly in the capitals of Europe, the conversations are not taking place as they should, that there are still echo chambers, that there are bubbles that seem to suggest that the reality in the world is not the reality. I put it another way, that in a sense, you know, people within the bubble all instinctively understand that things have changed, that there's a new world order in the making. I'm not quite sure exactly what replaces the status quo, but the sense is that the emperor no longer is wearing any clothes, but those in the bubble sense this, but they don't speak about it to each other. And they are determined to ensure that the rest of the world no longer does not, in fact, recognize this. But the truth is, everybody in the world sees the emperor no longer is wearing clothes. And the conversation has taken place. The world has moved on. And when the EU, in its partnership, says to Africa partners or partners wherever they are in the global south, you know, it's us against them, that no longer resonates anymore. The world has simply moved on. So thank you, Junior. Thank you, all of you, for a wonderful 2 hours. Thanks again.